All right, this is chapter 6, homework problem number 1. It says, suppose the European Suites incurs $140,000 of fixed cost each month. So I'm going to circle that number. That's a total fixed cost each month. Here's the question. It says, compute the A, total fixed cost, and B, fixed cost per guest if the hotel has 22,000 guests next month. And then it says compare the fixed cost per guest at the higher occupancy rate to the fixed cost per guest if they only had 2,100 guests. So they want you to do a comparison, and basically it's a cost per unit. So part A is pretty easy. It's 140,000. Since it's fixed, that does not change. So the total fixed cost doesn't matter if you have 22,000 guests or 2,100 guests. It's not going to change. So the answer here is total fixed costs do not change to any changes in volume. Therefore, the total is still 140,000. So the second part of this is to get the cost per guest, you just have to divide. So if you take the 140,000 and divide by the 22,000 guests, and then take the 140,000 and divide by the 2,100 guests, over off to the side here you can see you get $6.36 versus $66.67. So obviously you want to have a higher occupancy rate because your costs are higher. If you look at it, it says if only 2,100 guests stayed during the month, the fixed cost per guest is actually much higher than when 22,000 is staying in the month. So that's basically the key with production as well. Typically you want more volume. If you have a fixed cost structure, the more volume essentially reduces your fixed cost per unit. This is chapter 6, homework problem number 2. We've got, it says, assume the local fitness club charges a membership fee of $60 per month. That, guys, is a fixed cost. And then it says, for unlimited use of the exercise equipment plus an additional fee of $7 for every instructor-led exercise. That essentially is a variable cost per unit. All right, now, the requirements of the problem, number 1 says express the monthly cost of belonging to a fitness club in a cost equation. And then part 2 and 3, you're going to basically be estimating your expected cost based on volume. Part 2 is if you had 8 classes, and then part 3 is if you attended 16 classes. So the basic equation, y equals a plus bx, that's the concept. A being your fixed cost, b is your variable cost per unit. Your equation would be y is equal to $60, which is your fixed cost, plus 7x. So the way they worded it over here, they basically said 7x plus 60. It's the same thing. But remember, the 60 is the fixed cost part of it. Part 2 says if you intended 8 classes, you'd simply take y is equal to 60 plus 7 multiplied by 8. That's going to give you $116. That's part 2. Part 3 says if you took 16 classes per month, will your total cost double? No, because you have 2 parts here. You have a fixed part and a variable part. The fixed part's not going to change, but the variable part will double. So to calculate this one, it's going to be y is equal to 60 plus 7 times 16. So notice up here, you're going to get a variable part that's going to be changed from your $56 to $112. That's where they got this number. But your total cost would end up being $172. All right, this is chapter 6, homework problem number 3. We're talking about absorption and variable costing. This is Movie City makes DVD players and uses both absorption and variable costing. Assume that they incurred the following manufacturing cost in producing 40,000 DVDs last month. So this icon, I've already clicked it. All the data goes right here. They've already summarized it in terms of your 3 product costs. You've got direct material, direct labor, variable overhead, and fixed overhead. Note that the first 3 are all variable cost, and of course you have your 1 fixed cost. Part 1 says, what is the product cost per unit using absorption costing? Well, that's simply going to be your $35. That's all of your basic product costs that you would have learned in your previous chapters. So notice you would have direct material, and of course you've got your direct labor. That's your product cost number 1, 2, and then of course here's all of your overhead, these 2. So $35 would be your product cost. Think of this as kind of like your GAAP type of cost of goods sold number. And then the question says in part 2, how will the fixed manufacturing overhead be expensed if the absorption costing method is used? Remember that you only expense overhead, which is your product cost, when you actually sell your product. So you actually have to sell the product to expense it because it's considered inventory. So when you look at this, it says under absorption costing, the fixed overhead becomes part of the product cost of each unit. The $13, that's the cost per unit, that's the fixed part of it, will be expensed as part of cost of goods sold every time a unit is sold. But essentially, all of your product costs, all the $35 is expensed each time your product cost is sold because all those represent inventory. Part 3 says, what would be the product cost per unit for the variable costing? Well, that's just going to be the first three. That's going to be the 5 plus the 10 plus the 7. That's just the variable part of your cost of goods sold. So there's your $22. They essentially treat that as your product cost. Part 4 says, how will the fixed overhead be expensed if the variable costing is used? Well, essentially, variable costing treats everything just like a period cost. So that total of $520,000 will be expensed just like a period cost in the month of operations. All right, this is chapter 6, problem number 4 in your homework. We've got the previous manager for Just For You Gym started the following schedule, but left before completing it. The manager wasn't sure, but thought the club's fixed operating costs were $25,000 per month, and the variable operating costs were $2 per member. And it says they could serve up to 900 members. So if you look at this schedule, they've given you 3 different sets of volume. You've got 200 members, 400 members, and 900 members. So to fill this thing in, the total fixed costs are the same for each category. So notice the 25,000, you can just copy that across. The same with the variable cost per unit, which is $2 per member. That's also considered fixed per unit. So the 2, and 2, you can just kind of copy those across. Now, to fill in the rest of this, if I start with 200 members, if you take 2 and multiply that by 200, that's going to give you 400, right? So then you take 400 plus 25,000, there's your 25,400. And of course, we already know that 2 plus 125 gives you 127. Again, the way you get the 125, I'm going to write this over here. Again, you just take the $25,000 total fixed cost, and you're going to divide that by 200. That's where you get the $125 per member. For the column, it says 400 members. Again, to get the 800, again, you take the 2, you're going to multiply that by 400, that gives you 800. And then to get the cost per unit, again, you take the 25,000, which is your total fixed cost, divide that by 400, and that's going to give you the $62.50. The last column, again, to get this $1,800, you take the 2, multiply that by 900, that gives you 1,800. So here's your totals there. And then again, to get the fixed cost per unit, which is the only other thing you didn't know, you just have to divide that by 900, and you get 2778. Notice if you look at the rules for cost behavior, look at the fixed cost in total, which is the same 25, 25, 25. But look at what happened to the fixed cost per unit as volume went up. Notice you were at 125, then it went to 62.50, and then finally it dropped to 27.78. That's ideal. That's what you want. Typically, more volume is going to reduce your cost per unit. Part 2, the rest of it says, as the manager, it says, why shouldn't you use the average cost per member to predict total cost at different membership levels? Well, guys, you can't do that because you have 2 different cost components. You got fixed cost and you got variable cost, and these have different rules with how they behave in terms of activity. Like I just explained, if you looked at the variable cost per unit, $2, $2, $2, that's fixed. The fixed cost per member, that's not the same. That's variable. That actually decreases as activity goes up. So if you look at the answers down here, I've already plugged them in. I've already explained this. But this is basically what you've got, the cost behavior patterns. And so you really have to look at these individual components in terms of how do your activities behave. You can't just do an averaging technique. All right, so this is chapter 6, problem number 5. This is going to be an income statement using variable costing and absorption costing. I went ahead and already clicked on the icon. All your data is over here. Notice you have a selling price of $65. They've given you all your variable product costs, which is direct material, direct labor, variable overhead, which is $31, variable operating, which is $2. You've got fixed overhead, which is $208, fixed operating, which is $89, and then here's the units made and sold is $13,000. Now off to the side here, I'm going to go ahead just ahead of time, take that $208,000, which is your fixed overhead, and if you divide that by what you produced, that's going to give you $16 per unit of fixed overhead. You're going to need that when you do your absorption costing income statement. So over here on your contribution margin or variable costing income statement, notice you've got your sales here. The way they're doing that, you're just taking the 13,000 units sold and you're going to multiply that by $65. The variable cost of goods sold, you take the 13,000 what you sold and multiply that by the $31. They gave you that. And then the variable operating, which would be your 13,000, multiply that by the $2. They gave all this to you in the bullet points. You add those up, subtract, you get your contribution margin of 416. The fixed overhead, which is treated like a period cost, and the fixed operating, which is period, you just simply subtract those. You get net income for variable costing to be 119,000. So now when we go to the next part, when we look at the absorption costing income statement, notice your cost of goods sold for absorption costing will be the $31 plus the 16. So to get the cost of goods sold, you'll be using $47 on the next one. So you can see partial answer down here. On the next slide, I will show you the full answer. So notice what I previously said, you'd have $31 plus the 16, so $47 is essentially going to be your cost of goods sold number under absorption costing. So down here, notice your sales is still the same. Your cost of goods sold, you still got that 13,000 units. You're going to multiply that by the $47, which is essentially all of your product cost. That's going to be the 611. You would subtract that to get your gross profit. And then, of course, your period expenses would be the variable operating, which is 13,000 times the 2. We've already actually calculated that up here. There's your 26,000. And then essentially you have to add in the fixed operating of 89,000, which was given up here up above. Those two added together would be your total period. That's how they would get the 115,000. You would subtract that again to get your operating income of 119,000.